Hello and welcome to the Rubber Duck Dev Show. I'm Chris.
I'm Creston.
And tonight we're going to talk about what things were like when we were little babby programmers. Little tiny ones. Itty bitty. With our clay tablets. But before we do that, you had some exciting news about the Jamstack this week, right?
Yeah. So went ahead and moved forward with this headless CMS I was talking about. So I went ahead and took my Rails app and just modified it to be able to essentially record blog stuff. And how I set it up is to insert IDs for images, audio, and video for like the YouTube video or in the podcast. Those are just attributes to the record. And I went ahead and decided to set it up that way. I did a simple API to be able to pull down all the posts. And then I used the middleman feature dynamic pages to be able to call out to that API, pull down the post information, and then use that to build out all the pages for each episode. So the way it was working before, there's no concept of like a controller and a view in middleman. Basically, you have these templates, but there's no real Ruby file to be able to store data. I mean, I tried a bunch of different ways, but the only way I found to actually be able to do it, they have one config.rb, and basically that's where all the code goes. You can break it out, I think, into a separate file, but basically I just use that one file and use this dynamic pages to be able to pass data to it. Otherwise, I don't see a way with the static site generator to pass dynamic data from a particular place. I mean, I suppose you could just, they're using ERB template, so I could embed Ruby right in the template. So that's possible, but I wouldn't want to call that for every page to render. That would be a nightmare.
Yeah.
But anyway, using this, I was able to get it working. And as a result of this, well, let me take a step back. So how middleman works is that I had there's a one-to-one relationship of template page and actual page, and it pulls data from a YAML file. So basically all the data is stored in this YAML file, and you can call it to be able to pull the data onto the template. So basically, the only thing that varies but the reason I needed these templates per page is because that is what defines what the URL slug is. But with this dynamic pages, I don't have to do that. So essentially with this new setup, so quite long-winded, my apologies. with this setup, I was able to remove a 4,000 plus line YAML file, 200 episode pages. This is from Scaling Postgres, not Rubber Duck Dev Show, because I did both of them. And the numbers are just bigger for Scaling Postgres. So there you go. So 200 episode pages, 20 episodes pages. This is where you go next page. Well, I had separate page and a structure for that.
Oh boy.
As well as 400 images, because I was keeping two sizes of each image.
Oh.
But what I moved to is using a image service called Cloudinary, and I'm using that for another purpose. So basically I repurposed it because that enables me to just upload the image once and then get variants of it pretty easily.
Mm-hmm.
And I can put what the final URL is right in the code. Because I explored using Rails's active storage, but that would have been difficult to work with because then it's pushed to AWS. Well, how do I get it out of AWS to build the file? There was a whole lot of, it wasn't really built for my use case. So basically how I thought about it is, all right, well, it's just another set of media. So YouTube, I just need essentially an ID with it that is able to build a URL to render or embed a YouTube video. Same thing for podcasts. There's an ID that they give you that you put into a URL and you embed the podcast. Well, I'm essentially doing the same thing for the images. I upload them to Cloudinary. They give me an ID and I put in a URL to be able to render the image. So yeah, so doing this, I'm super happy because now if to publish an episode, I just go to my homegrown headless CMS I did and just say new post, fill out the form, click submit, add the references or the links for that episode. And then I just go to middleman and run the build.
Nice.
And it's all done. Whereas before, I used to have to create a page, update the YAML file, there was multiple steps having to go back and forth.
Yikes.
That, yeah, I mean, any other programmer would probably be pulling their hair out. But I'm like, well, it works. Don't rock the boat. But once I found this solution, I'm like, oh, this is so much better. So there's only one thing. There's only one thing that is still static, and that's the index page that says what episode is coming up. So that's the only thing. If I can go in and change that per weekly. I mean, I could automate that in terms of putting it in the CMS tube or the headless CMS, but I'm not worried about that right now.
Right. Well, that's cool. So that the Jamstack stuff is really useful.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, I've been using it for years.
Just didn't know that.
No, I knew what it was and I knew that's what it was called. But the thing that directed me to push more was this headless CMS. So I wasn't using that at all. I was using the standard flow and middleman of the static pages and the 1,000+ line YAML file. That is the database.
Eek.
Where all the data is stored. So.
Well, this sounds way better.
Oh yeah. And I was able to, automate the transfer of it and program the transition. So once I had done the Rubber Duck Dev Show, which took, I don't know how many hours, but once I did that, to transition all 200 episodes of Scaling Postgres, because it was mostly automated, took like less than an hour to go in and change this code here,
Oh, nice.
And run some stuff. And it was, took a 20th of the time it took the Rubber Duck Dev Show. But I'm like, okay, it works. Now I just need to apply it to the other site. So it's not been, these changes haven't been published yet because I didn't want to change anything on a show night.
Right.
But that'll be coming soon.
Cool. Well, I had kind of an uneventful week. I was doing a lot of support. There was one of our biggest clients has got their staging environment getting ready to go to production in like a week or two. And so we're just getting inundated with a bunch of last minute tickets. So I've had to be head down in logs all week. But it's just one of those things you got to do when you're a developer. It's you got to handle the support sometimes too. We have a support team, but they can only do so much. They're not code people.
Yeah.
So
they can't look at the code to see this is why it's
right.
happening.
They can get all the information and ask a bunch of questions, but when there are a lot of support tickets that are just like, I don't know why it's doing that. Just pass it to a developer. So, but anyway, so mostly uneventful stuff for me this week. Lots of admin behind the scenes goofy things. I may have spent a grand total of maybe 5 hours actually doing code in a week. It was which can get a little frustrating, but it's the job. It's what you do.
Yeah, ebbs and flows.
Yeah. So, all right. So here's the fun stuff. We're going to use the Wayback Machine and talk about where we started in our careers and what things were like and how we got into it and why we got into it and all the fun history stuff. So I'm gonna let you start it out. Go. Why did you get into programming?
Well, I wasn't a wee baby. It took me a long time before I did it. So basically, I've always been a techie working and fiddling with computers, but I never did a whole lot of programming. My parents would get computers. They'd try to, use them somewhat in the business. I'd always be playing games with them, but I'd always be tinkering with them and configuring them. Okay, let's get the printer working. Let's get this disk storage working and whatnot. And so much so that, when they were actually using computers for the business, I remember distinctly in my high school, they had, what do you call like intercoms or whatever, like speakers that the people in the administration could basically ring up different classrooms. And I remember coming over the PA say, please have Creston call his parents at the conclusion of class. I'm like, okay, what's going on? People are like, uh-oh, what's going on? Is your aunt died or your uncle died or is there something going on? So I used, this is how long ago it was. There were no cell phones. Went down to the payphone, put in my quarter, called my parents, and they're like, when you got the computer and you're trying to get it to do this, how do you do that? So I was doing a support call between classes in high school.
Oh God, it never stops.
Now I would type code in for magazines and stuff, and I never really wrote a lot of my own. So, I was always with computers. I was always fixing them, fiddling with them, but I didn't really do a whole heck of a lot of coding. And at the point where I was going to college, I was teetering between engineering school or the arts and sciences school. So, and it not necessarily I was going to do computers and engineering because I could have done mechanical engineering or electrical engineering or, something else. Mm-hmm. But I eventually chose arts and sciences with the goal of doing biology. And through my whole undergraduate, never took a single computer course. But I still always tinkered with it and fiddled with it. Maybe not as much as I usually did. I kept learning about computers, and primarily that was to play PC games, because to play PC games, you had to know on DOS, the disk operating system, you had to know how to edit autoexec bat and config.sys to no end to get those programs to run and not crash.
Oh, the black screen. Yay.
And so that was through my undergraduate. And then I actually went to graduate school after I graduated because I was going to be doing a PhD in cell and molecular biology. So I started in that. And even there, I was like setting the computers up, getting them connected to the internet, again, all fiddling with them. And I started enjoying the computers more than my lab work that I was supposed to be doing. So I was like, all right, my plan is I'm going to finish out my PhD, but I'm still going to do kind of computer stuff on the side because I love doing it. And maybe I'll get a job, kind of see if I can merge both of them. And when I was made that decision, this is the one time I took anything computer related, is I audited. So it wasn't for a grade, but I audited a course in C. So that is the only course I ever took related to programming or even computers in general, I think, in my entire school career. And it was an audited thing. So as you can tell, I have a lot of experience not. So what happened at that point is my plans well, it didn't get derailed because I was interested in doing it. I got a job opportunity doing being a systems administrator. So basically working on computers and servers and stuff like that at the same college where I was doing my PhD. So I went ahead and pulled the parachute on that and got out of the PhD program and started doing systems administration. Did a project with that, and they said, okay, we want to give you some more responsibility. And then I started doing a lot of database administration, primarily with Microsoft SQL Server. Now, at this point, we were doing a fundraising conversion that, I mean, I should say it's like a CRM conversion. They were switching over their customer relationship management system.
Mm-hmm.
And then I got my hands into some Microsoft Active server pages because there was something written using the Microsoft Web ASP pages. And the package system that we were using was incredibly slow generating transaction history. Like it would be spinning for minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And I looked at it because with Microsoft SQL Server, you can actually see the queries that were being sent to the database. And basically my head exploded. I was like, no wonder this thing is taking 2 minutes. And basically I rewrote an ASP page that presented the data that was of interest and did it in like maybe 2 or 3 calls, and it rendered in like seconds versus minutes for this product that we paid for. So that shows an indication of my, my performance consulting that I tend to do is I look at things like, this is too slow.
Yeah.
Should be doing it this way.
Yep.
That evolved into doing some Cold Fusion related stuff. So did some Cold Fusion related stuff in a first version of like an online form like my product does. And then at that point, pretty much we talked about starting the company, and I started the company, and it was probably around 2008 we were talking about it, and you were saying you should use Ruby on Rails, or we should use Ruby on Rails. So I'm like, okay. So I buy 3 books, read them, did the practice, and then I'm like, okay, start. And just start building the thing.
Yep.
So basically, I have no programming degree. I only audited a C course in graduate school. Other than that, I've never took, so no high school, no college education really for credit on programming. I just have always been a tinkerer. And if I ever needed to learn something, I went and read a number of books on the subject and then started doing it.
Yeah, and I've run into a lot of developers that have kind of a similar story. There was no inkling of being a developer until after they got into the workforce, and then they said, "Oh, this is a thing I like doing," and kind of fell into it. So it seems like I run into those people more often than I went to college for programming type folks. That doesn't seem to be as common. And I think it's because development has so many different aspects to it. There's, kind of the logical engineering aspect. There's an aspect of art to programming, creativity and stuff. There's math involved. There's storytelling involved. There's all kinds of expertise that needs to go into development, and it's a big thing. So I think that's probably why you see a lot of people that didn't start as programmers or developers and kind of work their way into it through their careers. My story's a little different, but not too much. I mean, because I started with, going. I can remember my dad got the Apple II. Our first home computer was an Apple II.
Yep.
And the big 5.25-inch floppy, double floppy. Oh, I had the double floppy disks. I was the big cheese on the cul-de-sac, buddy. All the friends came over to play the big games because I had 2 disk drives in my computer. But he did IT stuff he was a naval officer, and he was doing some IT stuff and got a master's degree in information technology and things when I was younger. So we always had computers around. And I can remember one of the things I would do kind of for fun was go down to the bookstore. Kids, a bookstore is where we had these things called books that were physically in a store that you would buy and read. In the mall, that's a big building that has lots of different stores in it that you would go into, and most of the time they would have a bookstore. So I'd go down to the mall to the bookstore, and they'd have these programming books that you could buy that were basically they were just lists of code in BASIC. And so it'd say, okay, this is the magic bouncing ball, and you'd have like these 5 pages of basic code, and you'd type it in, and then you'd get to see this square ball bounce around the screen. Oh, that's so cool. So then I got into when I was probably 6th grade, I got into this thing called Olympics of the Mind, which was basically teams of people from different schools would get together and compete on brain game challenges. And there was one year where we had to build this robot that would autonomously move through a grid and pick up certain things and avoid other things. And that was the first real programming I ever did, because I didn't do the robot building bits. There were some other kids that had parents that helped them with that. But I was helping with the programming of the robot, and it was very rudimentary, simple stuff. We're not talking about advanced AI here. It may sound from the description like it was some advanced robot, but it was really simple stuff. But still, in 6th or 7th grade, that was a big deal, especially back in the mid 80s when nobody did that stuff. But in high school, I kind of got away from all of that stuff, and I wasn't really into computers. I'd play games every once in a while, computer games, but go over to my friend's house on their Commodore 64s and wait 20 minutes for a game to load up off of a cassette tape. Oh God, I remember those days. That was hideous. But I didn't really do much with computers. And I actually started my undergrad degree for electrical and mechanical engineering.
That's funny how you say that.
Right.
I was considering the engineering school. Yep.
Yeah. And that does seem to be a commonality, is that this engineering mindset goes into programming a lot.
Software engineering.
Right. But that lasted a semester, and I said, "Nah, engineering's not my thing." So I went into business, the business school, and they had just started a degree that was kind of a blended CS and management degree. It was management science and information technology. So I got into that and ended up having to take quite a few coding courses. I had to take C, C++, Fortran, COBOL, but we never got down to like bit coding and stuff. We weren't the pure CS things. I wasn't in there wiring motherboards and stuff, but I got exposed to a lot of stuff like that. Plus the management courses and the marketing and the accounting. Accounting sucked, but the marketing and the management science things and all that. But I got interested in, there was a course on databases. And of course, this used Microsoft Access. and we were doing a lot of rudimentary things with, building an access database, figuring out how to get data into and out of Excel spreadsheets and manipulate things and write SQLs. And I ended up doing some extra projects for my professor because I was just interested in learning that. So I helped the business school set up their one of their information systems in house, programmed a bunch of it, set up the database and stuff, which actually ended up earning me the 4 credit hours that I was short for graduation because my advisor didn't calculate correctly. So that was good, but but that's kind of I kind of grew into programming through databases. And then my first job, the reason I got my first job is that out of about 100 applicants, I was the only one who knew how to write a select statement in a database. So they said, that's why you're hired.
That's scary.
It is. Well, I mean, to be fair, this is back in the early 90s. So, the internet wasn't even really a common thing yet. So, that would be really scary now. But, back then it was.
Well, I'm sure there's plenty of people that don't know how. They just rely upon their programming language's interface to do things.
Right. Or they can just Google it. Back in the early 90s, you couldn't Google it. There was no such thing. So then I started getting into actual programming. I started with kind of database management and SQL writing, and that morphed into programming as I got further and further on into my field. But most of my career has been kind of like my degree. It's been split between actual coding and project management stuff, more of the management side things, which I really enjoy. So that's kind of the track I took. But looking back, it's funny that because you were talking about putting code in out of magazines, and that was kind of the only place you could see code because you couldn't go on the internet and look at it.
There was no internet,
right?
Or no, it existed, but only for
the military.
Military, yeah,
and higher education places. But yeah, it was. I just remember, doing a couple of programs at home, and it was just such a wild thing to see this little, bouncing glob of pixels around the screen. It wasn't even bouncing; it was just moving. And it would take, like pages and pages of code to get that to happen. And it wasn't even color; it was just a white thing on a black screen. But that back then, that was really cool that you could get something to do that. It just,
Yeah, I mean, I did something similar, like with the Atari. They had a bouncing Atari symbol. This is the Atari computers, not the actual video game console. And I remember getting that to work and thinking, oh, yeah, that's cool. So this is part of my tinkering. It's like I never would really call it programming, type thing. But I would look at code, like even when I was in my graduate degree, they had some programs that they relied upon that were written in Fortran. And I remember looking at some of the code. I don't think I ever modified anything, but still, I would build Excel formulas to do some data analysis and things like that. But, never really built an actual program.
Yeah, all I can say is thank God by the time I got out of college and into the workforce, Fortran was a dead language because, oh God, that was horrible.
Well, it was around while it's still around.
Oh, yeah, it is. But I didn't have to try to find a job. There was other stuff. Sure. At that point, it was COBOL and Fortran were mostly just being used by legacy servers at like big banks and stuff like that. I think some of them still are actually, which is a little frightening, but yeah. But yeah, those I really did not enjoy any of the language classes that I had in college. It was I really did not like those classes.
Now, out of curiosity, why is that? Is it that Why do you think that is?
I don't know, because because now I love learning new languages, programming languages. I'm unilingual in spoken languages, but
Yeah.
um, but programming languages, I just love learning new languages, and they really interest me, and seeing the differences in syntax and stuff like that. But when I was in school, I guess I was really much more interested in the management business side of the education. The only technical side thing that I really got excited about was the database stuff. And I guess that appealed to kind of my information organization mindset, which is kind of translates to project management. It's probably why I like that so much, is because it's organizing information and making systems that can deal with that information efficiently. But yeah, the languages, it could also be because there weren't any really, I guess the languages I had to take, I suppose you would call them like second generation 2GL languages, because it was, like C and C++ and Fortran and COBOL. So it was really arduous, and it was just really nasty to write. They weren't fun to write languages like Ruby is. I mean, Ruby is fun to write in.
But do you think it was the languages, or do you think it was how it was taught?
It could have been some of how it was taught. I mean, those classes were pretty dry. It was kind of hard to stay awake in them a lot of times.
I mean, a lot of classes, they seem to have a lot of theory, and I guess that I have less patience for theory.
hmm
I guess show me mechanically how it, because I always have an interest in, I've two big buckets of interest with regard to technology stuff is, and then, or technical things. One is understanding how something works. That's kind of like why I went the biology route and why I found that interesting, because I was always discovering how things worked. And the other side is building things. So I'm kind of like, give me the nuts and bolts of how this language works and its primitives and whatnot. Okay, and now I want to build something with it, or do something with it.
hmm
So a lot of theory crafting and stuff like that, I'm kind of like,
See,
I don't have the patience for.
I'm actually kind of the opposite from that. I think I like more, because the programming classes were very mechanical. It was, this is how you do this kind of line. This is how you do this kind of method. This is the structure. This is the mechanical stuff. Okay, now regurgitate it on the test. There wasn't any real creative thinking involved in those classes. I'm not saying the languages didn't involve creative thinking, or programming with them didn't, but those classes had no creativity to them. It was just, here's the mechanical bits of this language, spit them back out on this piece of paper. And that just didn't intrigue me, because I like to look at systems and kind of break them down and find ways to make them more efficient. Identify the inefficiencies in systems and figure out ways to automate them, or reduce the amount of risk in them, or make them flow better. And those programming classes just didn't afford me an opportunity to think like that, because they were never big enough projects to have a system, right?
Yeah.
They were just,
And I think that's a little different than kind of I was thinking about theory crafting, like why this is the best language and doing it, why we do it this way versus the other way. I think more of the theory crafting
yeah.
as opposed to some of that. But
Or yeah, the theoretical stuff about databases like BCNF form, which has no practical use at all. I mean, Boyce Codd is, yes, you can get it to that level of,
well, no, it's the
but
normal forms above Boyce Codd that
well, yeah. But I mean, even Boyce Cod ends up kind of breaking down in the real world.
Well, yeah.
But yeah, that kind of stuff that's just purely I understand the value of that kind of thinking for advancement and stuff. I just don't have the patience for that kind of thing. But I do like the more thinky parts of the more creative thinking parts of development rather than the mechanical parts of development. I think, I do both, but I prefer, sitting at a whiteboard, drawing out diagrams, thinking through issues, finding flows and things like that is just what I like to do.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of what you're talking about here is I'm thinking about, what I was doing with this headless CMS is that how am I going to handle the images? I probably spent more time thinking about that and struggling as opposed to coding, just thinking, how am I going to do this? What way is going to work? What ways are going to paint me in a box and not work? And exploring each of the different options because I could have done it 5, 10 different ways, but then finally ultimately saying, all right, why don't I just treat it like I'm doing the audio and the video where it's just this unique identifier that it can be built into a URL. Just treat it that way and have an external service take care of the image
Mm-hmm.
and not building it in my, headless CMS thing. So basically my headless CMS just accepts that identifier that I can build a URL from, and that external system or that service provides the image on that for my behalf. So that was a very elegant way, and I didn't have to build in a whole image component to my homegrown's, CMS. So that was very elegant, and it saved a lot of time.
Mm-hmm.
What I was gonna, do.
Right, and I think that's the part I like most about the development is when I get to step back and kind of look at the whole thing and say, okay, let's figure out the best way to solve this problem because there's 85 different ways to solve this problem. Let's collaborate and find the best one, right? And I think I run into a lot of developers that are, I think, on the more mechanically minded side where it's let's just hack this code out and get this thing working. Next thing, let's hack it out and get this thing working. I don't like that. My brain doesn't work like that. I gotta, okay, how is this thing gonna fit into the rest of the system? And should we do this thing? Is it gonna fit correctly? Right? Or are we gonna have to make changes around it? And that kind of thinking just engages me, I think, more than the other. There's nothing wrong with the other. If I wasn't working with people who were mechanically minded, I'd never be able to actually accomplish anything because I'd be thinking all the time instead of actually doing stuff, I think. So I think it's important to have both of those mindsets on a team. But that the mechanical bits never really interested me, which is probably why I only lasted a semester in mechanical engineering in school. I was like, this no, this is not for me. But
Yeah, I have no experience, so I don't know what that was like.
all right.
What aspect of it did you not like, the mechanical engineering?
It was just too fiddly. It was too. I don't like to be down in the weeds, and mechanical engineering is, at least when the stuff I was taking was very down in the weeds. I prefer what I've always called programming from the press box, so that I can get up high and see the entire system. So yeah, I like to concentrate on one thing, but I like to have my eye on everything that's going on so that I know how I'm fitting and I can make adjustments if things outside that move. The engineering stuff was a lot more focused, and I'm trying to say this where it doesn't sound like I'm putting it down, because it's not like mechanical engineering is a bad thing and those people suck.
Well, we
No.
need them, or the
Right.
bridges and the buildings fall down.
Right. Exactly. I mean, it's important work, and they're really smart people. It's just I didn't like, my brain wasn't cut out for that way of thinking. It was too focused for me. I like being a little higher and looking at whole systems, which I know mechanical engineers sometimes will look at systems and stuff, but the stuff I was doing in my first semester at college for mechanical engineering wasn't that. And so it just kind of turned me off. So,
So, what would you say? Like, how did you learn to code? Do you think? Because you took more classes than I did, what was the thing that actually caused you to learn how to code? I mean, me, I've always just been fiddly, and I always just, meaning I've always been a tinkerer and a builder. So I said, I'm always like, all right, I want to build this thing. I get to understand the primitives. Okay, this is how you do a loop, a conditional, or what, variables, whatever.
right.
Like, okay. And then I have something in mind I want to build, and I just start building it. And then I hit a wall, and I either read more of a book, or if the internet existed, I looked it up on the internet to be able to get around the wall. And then I just keep going.
Right.
That's how I learned to code. It's essentially, there's a company that existed a while ago, and their motto was learn by doing. So
Mhm.
basically I just kept doing it and then learning more based upon the doing it. How would you say you actually learned?
I mean, I learned in college, because part of the degree was kind of CS based. I learned a lot about the fundamentals of programming, what a loop is, what an if statement is, what logical conditionals are, and things like that. But I don't think that I took much of that knowledge into my first job. It was more the database stuff, because I got so interested in that, got me into the first job. And of course, SQL is a type of programming, essentially. It has a lot of logicality to it, and conditionals and things like that. So what ended up happening was my boss just said, "Hey, I need you to start programming this thing." And I said, "Well, I'd like to still pay my bills, so I guess I'll learn how to program this thing." So, so it was just one of those learn by doing things, school of hard knocks kind of stuff, which is fine. I actually prefer learning that way. I'm not much for classroom learning. I was never very good at it. I'm much better at learning things by actually getting my fingers on them and doing them.
Yeah, I mean, that's an example of, I'm thinking about an example of where I had the ASP.NET pages. Did I have an aspiration to learn enough ASP.NET because I wanted to program in it? No, I had users that were frustrated with the package, and I looked into the problem and was horrified by what I was seeing. And I was like, this can't be that hard. So I looked into it, and I built something that was so much faster.
Right?
So I'm like, okay, there you go.
Yeah. Well,
And it's not like I kept building with it. There was a need, and I met the need, and there you go.
right. And the one thing that I do see as a commonality between almost every developer, software engineer, coder, whatever you want to call them, that I've ever met is that they love problem solving. I mean, when you strip all the rest of it away, what they really like to do is solve a problem. It doesn't matter what the problem is. They want to find a way to solve it. They also want to find a way to solve it that takes the minimum amount of ongoing work from them. Which, I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, but programmers are by nature, I think, lazy people. We don't want to do work, so we get computers to do it. which sometimes can be a lot of work. But, our mindset is, well, I don't want to do this over and over again. If I have to do it more than once, that's why we have computers. They don't care if they have to do it 1,000 times. So, and I'll sit in the Barco lounger and watch TV while the computer handles all that crap, So I think that's the mindset, is we just like solving problems, regardless of what kind of problem it is. And, because programmers, I routinely see them, here's a new problem. Okay, well, let me go looking for some technology that'll solve this. Not necessarily technology I've used before. It's not going to be the same thing I used to solve the last problem. It'll be a completely new thing, but I'm going to solve it, and I'll go find a way to do it. And that, I think, is the kind of the hallmark of what developers are, is they just like to solve problems. That's why they get into it, for the most part. I mean, some of them are into it for, the money, but, not early on. But anyway.
Okay.
So that's our stories. It was weird.
What was weird?
We have stories. Freaking chat spam. Anyway, chat spam. There's always a spammer. Hope you guys enjoyed that. We'd love to hear more about your stories. How did you get into programming? What parts of programming do you like? What parts of programming do you not like? Put it in the comments below. If you did enjoy this, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Mash all the buttons and ding all the bells. Join us every Wednesday night at 8 p.m. Eastern for more Dev Talk. Please tell your friends. And next week, we've got more mystery episodes. We're really kind of having an idea glut here lately, and just haven't had time to sit down and think ahead of things. Crazy
but
work
we had
times.
talked about having an kind of a continuation on this, is like kind of, if we were starting to be a programmer, what would we do differently?
Yeah.
Or what would we do today? And that's not necessarily means that that's going to be the episode next week, but because we may come up with another topic, but that's probably one that's going to be coming at some point.
Right. So if you want to stay up to date on what we're going to be doing, follow us on Twitter at Ducky Dev Show, and we'll put it up there. Also, you can hear this podcast on all the places that podcasts live, and make sure you visit us on rubberduckdevshow.com. Sign up for our newsletter and see all our episodes there. Until next time, happy programming.
Happy programming.